Okay, guys, so I put together kind of a high-level walkthrough here of what this is going to look like, and I'm basically going to boil it down into these three steps. So the first step is that we're going to deploy the Veeam software components that are going to be required for the managed service. That's going to include the Veeam Service Provider Console, Cloud Connect, the associated cloud gateways that are part of the Cloud Connect solution, and then optional will be Veeam 1 from a reporting, metrics, monitoring, alerting standpoint. Once we have those components provisioned, configured, and available, then we'll move on to what does it look like per tenant. And so per tenant, each tenant is going to need a backup and replication server. There will be one Veeam backup and replication server deployed per tenant, and its purpose is to manage the Veeam backup for Azure appliance that's natively running in Microsoft Azure. So if we look at the process would be we would create a new company in the Veeam Service Provider Console. We would then add the service provider credentials into the tenant Veeam backup and replication server. We would go in and add a managed server in that tenant Veeam backup and replication, which is going to allow us to either provision a net new or connect to an existing Veeam backup for Azure appliance. When that's finished, it will actually go through the process of provisioning the appliance if it hasn't already been completed. We'll establish some criteria around our workers that we want for basically the data movers, the proxy servers that'll be used in Veeam Backup for Azure as part of the appliance. And then finally, we're going to do the policy. So what does that look like? We can see up here in kind of the DMZ or the public facing area, we've got our service provider console, again in those cloud gateways. Down in the management zone, we've got our Cloud Connect server in Veeam 1. And then for each of these tenants, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to have a tenant VBR. These could be small VBRs. I'll call them middleware VBRs. It's really for establishing the connectivity between the Veeam backup for Azure to the Cloud Connect server, ultimately into the service provider console, which is going to allow you to control your usage reporting. Again, remember future integration with Pulse is a consideration there. And so hopefully this gives you a little bit better picture of what to expect. There is no mechanism today for the Veeam Service Provider Console to communicate directly with a Veeam Backup for Azure appliance. There's also no way to do usage reporting using your VCSP rental license for Veeam Backup for Azure workloads unless that Veeam Backup for Azure appliance is connected to a Veeam Backup and Replication server, which is ultimately being managed by Cloud Connect and configured through the Service Provider Console. So we'll move on now. I've mocked up an environment and I want to kind of step you through this process and hopefully clarify any outstanding questions that you may have. So I've logged into my service provider console, and much like we talked about earlier, part of our onboarding process will be that we need to create a new company. And so I'm going to step through that process here, and I'm just going to come down here on the left-hand side, logged in as a portal administrator into the Veeam Service Provider Console. Come down here on the left-hand side to Companies, and I'm going to create a new company. And for purposes of this, I'm going to call this company NTT. I'm going to put in my email address here just because I want you to see the welcome email that's going to be sent. We'll choose native as the company type. And we're going to create a password. We're going to enable RESTful access APIs of the backup portal. This is just in case you want to do some level of automation or custom type of integration. We're going to leave these off. This would be for Cloud Connect Backup, and this would be for Cloud Connect Replication. We're not using either of these. What we're really using this for is the ability to manage that Veeam Backup and Replication instance and manipulate it here from the Service Provider console. So we can talk about billing later. I'm just going to leave the default subscription here and step through this process. We can enable predefined company alarms. This is a fully managed service. It might be nice if you enable this box just so that the managed company has its own set of alarms that can be triggered independently in the client's backup portal. And we're going to send the welcome email. So we can now see here that we have the company NTT, and on the right hand side here it is creating the site resource. So I've just received the welcome email, and you can see that in the welcome email that it gives me the credentials, username and password that I'll need to be able to establish the connectivity to my Cloud Connect server. As I scroll on down here, you'll see that the Cloud Connect gateway address is provided along with the default port of 6180. So the next thing that we'll do is we will jump over to our Veeam backup and replication server that has been newly deployed for this tenant, and we'll add this information in there to establish our Cloud Connect management. Here we are on the newly deployed tenant VBR, and you can see that it's running the Community Edition. There's no license that's been applied. The license will actually be inserted from the Veeam Service Provider console. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to come down here to Backup Infrastructure, and we want to click on Service Providers and add a service provider. Now, if you remember before, the email gave us the information that we needed in order to establish this connection. We're going to allow the default port of 6180, and it's very important that we check this box, which is going to allow the Veeam backup and replication installation to be managed by the service provider. The next thing we'll do is we'll add our credentials. We'll establish our connectivity to the service provider, and it will save our settings along with updating the remote management setting. Remember, we checked the box to allow the service provider to remotely control this particular Veeam backup and replication instance, which will ultimately be connected to the Veeam backup for Azure appliance. So we'll give this just a moment to finish. Okay, now we have the ability to move on. We can see that the service provider has been added successfully, and we'll click on Finish. Give it a moment for it to complete a service provider rescan. And we can now click on Close. The next thing that we'll need to do is we'll need to properly license the tenant Veeam backup and replication server. And we can do that in one of two ways. We can install the license directly from the service provider console, since it's already able to see and manage that Veeam backup and replication server, or we can install the license directly on the Veeam backup and replication server itself. In this example, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use the service provider console to install the license. So I'm currently logged in as the portal administrator, and I will click on Configuration up here in the top right hand corner, and I will click on Licensing, and I'm going to come over to the Backup Server tab, and notice that I have a server here called lab-vbr02 in the company name NTT that is currently showing a status of unlicensed. So what we'll do is we'll select that server, and we'll click on Install, and we will browse to the rental license. and we will give it a moment for that license to be pushed down and installed on that server. And we will see it come back then with a valid licensed status. Okay, and you can now see that it's showing that it is valid. Lab VBR02, the license expiration date, again, company name, the number of points. We can see that none of them are currently being used. And at this point, we are ready to proceed with the next step, which is going to be to add a managed server on the backup and replication tenant VBR and begin to configure the Veeam backup for Azure appliance. I'm now back up over on the tenant Veeam backup and replication server, lab-VBR02, and I can just verify that the license has been applied by coming up here to what they call the hamburger menu and coming down and clicking on license. And you can see that there is in fact an Enterprise Plus rental license that is now applied to this machine. And we can check this box to enable update the license automatically, which is going to enable our usage reporting. Okay, and we can see that this is a brand new instance. And we will go ahead and click close here. So just stepping through this really quick, we can see again that this is a brand new Veeam backup and replication instance. And so now that we have the proper license applied, the first thing that we'll want to do is we're going to come down to backup infrastructure and we'll click on managed servers. We're going to add a managed server. And our option here is going to be Veeam backup for Microsoft Azure. We'll select that one and we can notice as we select it, it's going to connect to an existing appliance or deploy a new Veeam backup for Microsoft Azure appliance. So it starts our backup for Microsoft Azure appliance wizard, and you can see that it's going to give me the option to connect to an existing appliance or deploy a new appliance. So my assumption here will be that as you onboard each new tenant, that you'll want to deploy a new appliance. So we're going to select that option and we're going to proceed. Now the next thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to add our Microsoft Azure Compute account. We'll click on Add here. It's going to walk us through the Microsoft Azure Compute Account Initial Configuration Wizard, and we'll just click Next. We're using Microsoft Azure. You can see we have a few different regions here depending on where you are, Global, Germany, China, or Government Cloud. We'll choose Global. And we also have an option here to create a new user account specifically for the access of the Azure Resource Manager subscriptions, or we could use an existing account. So we could also enable direct restore of Linux-based computers as well if those are also going to reside in Azure. So something to keep in mind. So I'm going to click on create a new account and we're going to click next. Now for a brand new recently deployed Veeam backup and replication server, more than likely you may forget to install the Azure PowerShell module. And if so, this is the message that you'll get. It's just basically telling you that it looked for it and it could not find it. There is a convenient link here that you can click, and we provide the Azure PowerShell module as part of the Veeam backup and replication install. So when you click this link, it's automatically going to launch the installer and it's going to allow you to install this. So it's just real simple, accepting the agreement, clicking on next. It'll take just a couple of moments here to install this module. Okay, and we're done. We'll click on Finish. It will tell us that if we just installed this and the console was open, that we'll need to restart the console. So what that means is we'll need to cancel out of this, and we'll close our Veeam Backup and Replication console, and we'll reopen it. Okay, while we're waiting for that console to reopen, I just wanted to briefly take you over to the Azure Portal. And I just want to show you that I have a single virtual machine that's deployed here, just a little Linux web server with a single resource group. And I do not have any storage accounts that are created. This is operating at the moment under just the Azure free trial, but it's certainly good enough for purposes of what we're trying to do. So I'll go ahead and I'll flip back over to the Veeam Backup and Replication instance, and we'll proceed to deploy our Veeam Backup for Azure appliance. And we're going to go, as before, to Backup Infrastructure, and we're going to add a server. We're going to choose Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure. We're going to deploy a new appliance. We're going to add our account. Again, Microsoft Azure and Global. Okay, so we're going to create a new account, and we're going to enable directory store of Linux. Okay, so it automatically will open up a window here where we'll be able to and look at our Azure dashboard. We'll need to come over here to storage accounts and create a storage account. I'm going to put this in the Veeam resource group. I'm just going to call it Veeam USF Veeam storage. Each time I type it, it's going to check it to see if it's already been used or not. We're going to use standard performance. We can have some decisions here around the redundancy. I'm just going to choose LRS again because I'm doing this from a free trial standpoint. And we'll click on next. Really going to leave all of these alone. Continue through next. And we're going to create it. Okay, we can see that it's a Microsoft storage account. The status is accepted. And the deployment is complete. Okay, and after it's configured our account, then we can go ahead and click Next. If there was a need to do any kind of direct restore of Linux-based computers, you could certainly select this checkbox. You'll notice that when you do that, it brings up a couple of different options here, this helper appliance, and it would simply ask you to deploy this helper appliance, select the location that you would want to deploy it to, storage account, resource group. It'll create a new resource group by default, what virtual network that it needs to be deployed onto, etc. But for purposes of what we're doing, we're not going to do that, and we'll just go ahead and continue. and click Finish. So now our Azure Compute account is there. We can continue on and click Next. Show us our various subscriptions. Again, you can see that I'm on a free trial. I'm going to choose the East US Data Center. And I'm going to create an existing resource group. Actually, I'll just let it create a new one. I'm going to give it a name, NTT VBA. Click Next. I'm going to create a new virtual network and a new subnet with a new security group. And this is the backup server public IP address. We'll let it pick a dynamic IP. We could certainly select a static IP here if one was available. I've used one previously, so I'll use that one for this particular demo. And we'll click on Next. You can create a new key pair, or you can use a default key pair if you already have one. These are the credentials that will be added to the new Veeam appliance. So we can say Veeam. Okay. And then it's now going to go deploy our Veeam backup for Microsoft Azure appliance. You can see that it's accepting the license agreement, creating the resource group, creating the virtual network, the security group, the network interface. It's going to get the latest backup appliance image version from the Microsoft Azure Marketplace, and it's going to create the virtual machine called NTT-VBA. Flip over here, we can kind of go look a little real time at what's happening. Click on virtual machine, and we'll actually see that virtual machine show up here. Give this just a minute to update. You can see that it is creating the virtual machine, also creating the administrator credentials for the virtual appliance. And you can see that the Veeam appliance has been created in the resource group in the location. It's now running. It uses a standard size of a standard underscore V2S with 2 disks. And we can now see that it's waiting for the backup appliance to be powered on, go through its initial automated configuration, and report back to this particular Veeam backup and replication server that it is online and available for use. Move into the accepting of the license agreement. Now tells me that the backup appliance has been deployed successfully. I can click Next. I have an option here to open the Azure Blob Backup Repository Creation Wizard when I click on Finish. And we'll check that and click Finish. So now it's going to ask us for the appliance that we want to connect to. We're going to name it NTT Veeam Backup for Azure Repo. We need to specify some credentials. So we'll just click on Add. And at this point, we need the account and the shared key from the Microsoft storage account. And so to get that, come over here and we'll go to Home and we'll go to Storage Accounts. Click on the storage account. See here, Veeam NTT VBA. And come down here to Access Keys. We can show keys, and then we'll just want to copy this, and we'll want to paste that here, and we'll grab this first key, and we'll paste that there, and we'll continue on. So it's now created the Azure Blob Backup Repository. It's creating the Appliance Backup Repository. The Appliance Backup Repository has been created successfully. Now registers the external repository. That's been completed successfully. We can now click on Next. And finally Finish. So here we go. We now have our Microsoft Azure backup appliance that is added as a managed server. We also have an external repository that has been created as part of this process, and this is the Azure Blob storage that we named NTT VBA-repo. So now the next thing for us to do is to create a backup job. And what we'll do is we'll go to our Home tab and we'll go to Jobs and we'll click on Backup Job, and we'll see that there's now an option here for Microsoft Azure. And it says create a new Microsoft Azure backup policy. So we'll go ahead and click on that. And then what this will do is this will open up our default browser, and it will take us to the public IP address that was assigned to the Veeam Backup for Azure appliance. So just click Advanced and Continue. We'll pass the token for authentication, and we get to the Add Policy wizard. So what I have is, if I showed you earlier, come over here to home real quick, and virtual machines. I have a virtual machine here, web server that's running called Web01. And so this backup policy is going to be to protect, to back up this virtual machine called Web01. All right, so I'm going to call this backup Web01, and we'll go ahead and click on next. Next thing that we'll do is we're going to specify the Azure account. And we can, again, as always, little drop-down box here to see what our choices are. We'll leave this at the default Azure account. We're going to select the region that we want to be able to find the machine that we want to back up. And then we'll hit Add to move that over to the right-hand side. And we'll hit Apply. So we've now selected our region of East US. And our next option here will be to select the resource that we wish to protect. Remember, the resource is the virtual machine. The name was Web01. So when we select the resource to protect, we have a number of resources. We could select all resources to protect everything, or we could select individual resource types, whether it be the subscription or the resource group or the virtual machine, or by tag, depending on how we want to filter the individual machines for this particular backup policy. So I'll just choose virtual machine, and I can select this, and it will show me all the virtual machines that are in that particular region. You can see there the Web01 that I talked about earlier. We'll click on Add. It's now listed down here, and we'll hit Apply. So my account, the region, the resource to be protected. I could exclude certain resources if I want to, but I'll leave this alone, and I'll click on Next. Windows, I could enable application aware snapshots. This is a Linux web server, so I'll leave this off. I could enable some type of scripting. You'll see as I click these on, they give me options here for, say, things like pre-freeze and post-thaw scripts over here. Just to show you some of the different options. I will cancel out of this and leave this option off. Again, this is just a demo. We'll click on Next. We're going to enable backups because that's what we're here to do. The backups are going to be stored on the repository. When we define the schedule, we could select a hot and cool repository, and we'll click on Next. And what type of scheduling do we want? Do we want to enable daily retention? And if so, how many snapshots do we want to keep? How many restore points do we want to keep, and how long do we want to keep that? We can select and edit our daily settings here, and just make some decisions around how many times do we want to create a snapshot. Maybe we want one snapshot every hour so that we can roll back with a worst case scenario of 60 minutes. Maybe we just want to do one. So we could clear all. And we could select the time that we want to do that. We want to do 1. We're going to do that at 1 a.m. We want to run that every day. We want to keep, 7 snapshots. Okay, and then we select our repository. That's going to be the NTT VBA repo that we did earlier, and we'll hit Apply. Okay, so we've now got our daily retention. We're going to create 1 snapshot. We're going to keep the most recent 7 snapshots. We're going to create 1 restore point. We're going to keep that for 14 days. And we're going to store them on the repository called NTT VBA repo. We'll leave weekly, monthly, and yearly, the rest of the GFS there off for now, and we'll continue on. So this is now going to give us a cost estimation, kind of based on some assumptions. For the backup of this virtual machine. We can see it's going to cost $1.25 for the snapshot, 30 cents for the backup, 16 cents transaction fee for a total of $1.70. It is based on assumptions. We can click on this and it's going to tell us exactly what those assumptions are. Basically a daily change rate of 3%, a compression ratio of 2 to 1, and we're going to assume that 70% of the disk is occupied by data that we need to be able to protect. Okay. All right, so we'll click next. Same standard Veeam rules apply. We'll automatically retry 3 times. We're not enabling email notifications at this time. And we'll proceed on. This kind of gives us a summary of all of our settings. And finally, we'll click on Finish. So we have created our backup policy at this point. We can see that that policy has now been created here. Full disclosure, if I now come down here to my Veeam backup and replication server, and now you can see that the backup policy that we created in the Veeam Backup for Azure Appliance Portal is now showing up here in Veeam Backup and Replication. So now that it's shown up here, well, then we can jump over to our service provider console and we would be able to actually see this job now show up in service provider console. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you a couple different ways that you can run this job. So first of all, directly from here, VBR, just like any other job, you can certainly right click on this job and you can say start. And it's going to initiate that backup job via its communication to the Veeam backup for Azure appliance, and it will do its thing. The other thing you can do is you can go to backup infrastructure and you can come down here and you can click on this, and you have an option here to click on Open Console. And this is actually going to open up the UI for the Azure Backup Appliance, much like we saw earlier. So it will take us here. We've been here before. We can certainly come down here and click on Policies, and we see this same policy, at which point we could click on Start here as well. Third option, Service Provider Console. Let's jump over to the Service Provider Console. Okay, here we are back over at the Service Provider Console, and I can log in as the tenant. And once I've logged in, I can go to Backup Jobs. I can go to Virtual Machines. I can click on Public Clouds, and you can see that backup job that I created earlier. And it will give you the information, latest snapshot, last backup, last replica. It's never been run before. So let's go ahead and run it. We're going to actually do this from the Veeam Backup and Replication console because that's just where I'm at. So I'm going to click Home, I'm going to click on this guy, and I'm going to hit Start. So we're going to give that just a minute to get started. We can see that it's running over here. It's not only going to take a snapshot, right? But it's also going to do a backup based off of the snapshot. You can see the snapshot was really quick. If I click right here on Success, you can see that that snapshot was really fast. Now that that snapshot has been created, we're actually running the backup based off of the snapshot. So backup plan creation was finished. The snapshot backup of Web 01 has finished. The repository backup has been scheduled, and it is now proceeding to do its thing. So let's go back and look. Here we are. We can see similar information, right? We can see that the snapshot was a success. We can see that the backup is running. We can see the date and time. We can see down here that there's a pending operation. And we can see the date that the snapshot took. And we can see that the policy backup is running. There is a pending link here. We can click on this pending link, and it's actually going to now show us a little bit more information. We can see that the repository backup has been scheduled. Okay, so let's go back over to the Service Provider console. And when this is finished, we'll actually be able to see that we've got some protected data that's going to show up here. We don't at the moment. It's still in progress. We can see that it's trying here to refresh. And just as soon as that information is available in VBR and the service provider console has the opportunity to kind of pull that information, we'll actually see that information show up here. Okay, just a quick note, this failed. The reason that this failed, if I mouse over this, it actually shows me some really good information. And it's a quota exceeded error because I'm using the free trial. And so the only thing that I need to do in order to fix this is come up here on configuration and come down here to my workers and instances. There's no instances there, which is good. We'll go to configuration for the workers. And I'm just going to edit this. And basically what I want to do is select a smaller size. So it's just going to use a single CPU instead of two virtual CPUs. It's only reason I'm doing this is just to meet this limitation of the free trial. And I'll just go through and finish this process. It will give me a warning because the VM has less than 4 gig of RAM. It's just kind of a check that we do. But now that I have fixed that, then I can go back to my job and you can see here that the backup failed. And I will just rerun the job again. And this time it will complete successfully. Notice repository failed, could not find any workers. What that said was that it could not complete its operation due to it had exceeded its quota. Okay, so same thing that we saw before. Real quick snapshot. The snapshot was successful here at 218. It's now running the backup of this machine. And basically what it's doing right now is it's provisioning basically one of those workers, right? So if I come back up here to configuration and I come over here to workers and I click on instances, I can see that this worker has been provisioned. It's in the status of creating right now. And this is basically that on-demand proxy or data mover that gets created at the time that the backup policy is initiated or kicked off. So it's going to provision that worker, it's going to do the backup, it's going to complete the backup, and then it's going to actually tear down these workers. Depending on the number of virtual machines, you could have multiple workers that are all provisioned in success. That was that number that I modified earlier. Again, one VM, just a simple demonstration here. A single worker will be just fine. But I just wanted you to have this behind the scenes look of exactly what's happening here while this backup is occurring. And if I flip right back over here, you can see now in the Azure portal that there is this third virtual machine that is now here. And this is actually the worker that I was just talking about. You can see here it was provisioned with the A1V2 size. And this is the heavy lifter. And so again, when that backup is completed, this worker will automatically disappear and we'll see the completion of the backup job. Okay, and just to kind of give you another little update here, you can see now that it says that it's processing, which means that that worker is now beginning the process of transferring the data. And if I jump back over here, you can see that it no longer has a status of creating, but it has a status of busy. So I can jump back up out of here. I can come back down here to policies. Again, we can see that this is running, right? And this is very similar to what we saw over in the Veeam backup and replication interface. So the backup has now officially began. We can see a status there of 6% with 657 meg that's been transferred. Again, just kind of flipping back and forth real time, you can see that's the same information that's being reported here in the Veeam backup and replication interface. And I expect this job to be completed shortly. Okay, and we can see that this is just about finished. It's at 100%. As I come back over here and look at the same thing, we can see that this was a success. It's still running. And the reason that it's still running is if I jump back over here to configuration and workers again, we can see that it's going to be tearing down now this particular worker. We can see the worker shows a status of idle and complete our job. So back to policies, we can see everything is happy. It was a success. Flip back over to Veeam backup and replication. We can see that both the backup and the snapshot was a success. And so now when we log into the service provider console, we're able to see from a summary tab here, we click on virtual machine backup and choose public cloud. We have some visibility here into our protected virtual machines, our VMs by backup type, and then our VMs by number of jobs. And so what we're looking for is, first of all, we want all of our machines to be protected, right? And that one virtual machine is here. Here we can see, because of the nature of Azure Backup, that there's a snapshot. Snapshot is over here on the right-hand side, and there's also a backup. And then down here we can see that there is one backup job that has 2 copies of the data. Okay, and so when we click over here on virtual machines and we click on public cloud, we can see that here's the machine. We can see that the last policies were successful. From a protected data standpoint, when we click on virtual machine, we can see here that there is a 30 gig source, that there is one backup, and the most recent backup was 14 minutes ago, and we can click on that backup, and it will actually show us the job name, the last time it was run, the source size, the number of restore points. Okay, and there you go. So I hope this was helpful.